Layer effects are some of the most fun to use features inside Photoshop. In this lesson, we'll leave plain boring text behind and see how to spice up any typeface. Let's get started as always in our Chapter 7 folder, and let's open the file Type 1. Now if you get a warning message when you open this file asking you to update layers, you can simply hit the Update button. If you didn't get a warning message there, you may see a warning icon in your Layers panel on this text layer titled 6. Simply double-click on that warning icon, then hit the Enter key to commit to that updating, and you're fine. This file was created on a PC, and moving from Mac to PC with a lot of typefaces can sometimes be a little tricky, but if you simply hit Update, you'll be fine. I'm going to take us into full screen mode with menu bar by pressing the F key on the keyboard, and I'll zoom into 50% here. That's Command plus on the Mac, Control plus on the PC. And you can see we've got a fake promotional poster here. I'll confess that you may not shed pounds, look younger, or have a happier life after watching this training series, but you will be better at Photoshop. This document is chock full of text layers. How do we know that? Well, a quick visit to the Layers panel shows a ton of individual text layers. And what can we do with them? Well, before we add layer effects, what I'd like to do is add some color to these fonts. That will give us many more options when we apply layer effects. And here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to click on the very top text layer, and then shift-click on this third layer so that all three layers are highlighted and selected. That means that any change I make to one text layer will automatically be applied to the other. So I'm going to now open my character panel. If your character panel is not here in the dock from previous lessons, simply go to the window menu and select character. What I'd like to do is change the color. I'm going to simply click in this color swatch box. Here's my color picker, and I'm going to type in new RGB values. I want a dark gray instead of black, so I'm going to type 80 for the red, hit the tab key, 80 for green, tab again, and 80 for blue. Hit the return key to invoke the OK button, and now our top three layers of type are dark gray instead of black. Now let's do something about this shed pounds type. I'm simply going to click to highlight it in the Layers panel. Again, I'm going to go and click in this color box, but now we're going to do something very cool. For design consistency, I'd like for the headline type to take on a color that already exists in the image. So if I move my mouse over the image area, notice that as it hovers over this sleeve, the icon turns into an eyedropper, and if I simply click, this color from the shirt is applied to the text. I'll hit OK. Let's go down to Look Younger. I'll click on that layer to activate it. Again, click in the color swatch box, and this time I'm going to pick a blue from the shirt, a lighter tone of blue right about there. Looks pretty good. I'll simply hit OK. And be happier, we can't leave that alone. I'll click to select it in the Layers panel. This time I'm going to select a much brighter color. In fact, I'll pick up the white from this t-shirt. Notice that it's not a completely neutral white. It's got a hint of blue in it, but that's going to add a nice subtle touch to this design. I'll hit OK. Now we have some color to work with. The very first layer effect we're going to use is the most common, and that is a drop shadow. So let's go and click on the Adobe Photoshop CS5 Extended. That type is very big there, and it will be easy to see these results on screen. I'm going to zoom in at 100% view. That's Command 1 on the Mac, Control 1 on the PC. And I'm pressing the space bar to temporarily invoke the hand tool so that I can move this text to an area where you can see it. I'll close this character panel. And with my text layer selected, I'm simply going to go down to the bottom of the Layers panel and click on the Layer Effects icon. This brings up our Layer Effects menu, and I'm going to choose the drop shadow. This brings up the layer style dialog, and you can see a number of settings all at their default values. You're almost never going to want to use these defaults. They're very, very heavy-handed. So what I'm going to do is drop this opacity down to about 20%. So I'll move the slider here just about there. Looks pretty good. Next, I'll move down to the distance slider. As I drag it to the right, notice that the shadow moves further away from the text. we don't want to go that far, so I'll bring it back down and end up right around 6. That looks pretty good. If I drag the spread slider to the right, you can see the drop shadow spread out. We don't want to go too far with that either. I'll bring that down to about 5 or 6%, somewhere around there. We don't want to make a big move. And for size, we're going to leave this at the default. I'll show you what happens if you drag it to the right. When you keep going to the right, you simply obliterate any definition in there. So we're going to leave this right back at the default of 5, and we've got a nice, subtle, yet effective drop shadow. The last thing we'll do here is change the angle. You simply click on this line and rotate it around the circle. This changes the angle of the drop shadow in relation to the text. You can drag it to any angle that you desire. I think here, let's try to look for something about 111. Maybe let's boost it up just a bit, right about in the 170 range, 173. That looks great. And I'll simply hit OK. We have a nice, believable drop shadow. Now we have the total training line above this and the with host Amadou Diallo text line. If we want to apply this drop shadow to these other lines of text, instead of clicking on drop shadow and going back into the menu and remembering our settings and reapplying them, watch what we can do. I'm going to hold down the Option key on the Mac, Alt key on the PC, click on the word effects, and I'm going to simply drag this up onto the top layer. Now that drop shadow has been copied from our second text layer up to the first one. I can do the same thing, Option key on the Mac, Alt key on the PC, and drag this down to the with host Amadou Diallo layer. So now all 3 layers have the exact same settings for our drop shadow. That's a huge time saver. We don't have to start from scratch each and every time we work. I will show you an alternative way to be equally as efficient. If I double click on the word drop shadow, it'll bring back my dialog box, and at the very bottom, if you find yourself working with the same layer style values over and over, you can simply press this Make Default button, and every time you create a new drop shadow, it will start with these settings as opposed to the factory defaults. If you later change your mind and want to go back to those factory defaults, simply press the Reset to Default button. I'll press Cancel here because we didn't actually make either of those changes. Now that drop shadows are out of the way, I'm going to take you through some other layer effects that are very, very cool. You'll see in a moment that there are a lot of layer effects to choose from. I'm not going to take you through each and every one, but I will show you the ones that are most effective when working with text. I'm going to scroll down in my Layers panel and let's select the Shed Pounds text layer. Here we're going to add another layer effect, and this time we are going to start with an inner shadow. I'll move this box out of the way, and you can see the dramatic change that inner shadow applies to our text. We're going to leave opacity where it is. We'll leave the blend mode untouched. The distance, if I drag this to the right, you can see that it's actually moving that inner shadow away from our original text. We don't want to go too far with that. We'll leave it right here about 6 or 7. 7 doesn't look bad, so we'll leave it there. We have a choke slider. If I drag this to the right, it will add an almost beveled look. It restricts the original text color. We don't want to go too far with this either, so I'm going to back it off and leave it right about there at a value of 8. The size, as we did with the drop shadow, I'm going to leave that at its default. I will move the angle here a little bit. Maybe I'll come down just about there, for example. Just give it a nice bit of shading. Now in this text layer, I'm going to add a second layer effect. I'm going to click on Bevel and Emboss. I'd like to point out that 2 things happen when you click on the name of a layer effect. You get a check in the checkbox on the left. That means the effect is being applied, but you also have the settings for that layer effect show up directly to the right. What we're going to do is set Style instead of Inner Bevel. We're going to set that to Emboss. We're going to change the depth here. I want to get a little bit more embossed look there. Look at that. Look at what happens if we go very far. I'm not going to take it that high, but somewhere around here looks pretty good. I'm going to leave the bulk of the settings here at their defaults, but I am going to go down under Shading, Highlight mode is set to screen. I'm going to set that to multiply. I want a dark edge around the outside of the text. There we go. I'm going to hit OK. And now, by just selecting a couple of options, we have a vastly different rendering of text. If you want to see the before and after, I can simply go here to Effects and toggle this eye icon on and off. Here is the plain text. Here is the text with our layer effects. Let's go down to this second headline type, Look Younger. What can we do with this? Well, first we'll select it in the Layers panel. And this time, we're going to take a look at Outer Glow. I'll slide the image over here to the left to get a better view of it. With Outer Glow, we're going to leave our blend mode at the default of screen. We'll leave opacity and noise at their defaults. Here I've got a nice sort of bright yellow color. If you have a different color here, I want you to click on this color swatch and simply type in these RGB values, 255 red, 255 green, and 190 for the blue, and then simply hit OK. Down here under Elements, I want you to make sure your technique is set to softer, and we're going to change the spread value here. As we drag to the right, we get more of a glow. It spreads out further, and we want to go pretty far with this. We want to make this change very obvious. 43% looks pretty good. And now we're going to look at yet another amazing layer effect, the gradient overlay. Again, I mentioned that if I click on the text gradient overlay, I see my options. If I wanted to add it without seeing the options, I would simply click this checkbox. But let's click on the text gradient overlay so that we can manipulate this default setting. I'm going to change the blend mode here. Instead of normal, I'm going to set it to screen. That's going to be a nice blend between our original text color, which was the blue that we pulled into the shirt. We have a nice gradient here, but this is a linear gradient. We are going to click on Style and change that to Reflected, and watch what happens. Right now, the gradient is light at the top and dark at the bottom, but if I change it to Reflected, you can see this gives us a mirrored effect. The gradient is now starting at the top and the bottom of the text. I'm going to adjust my scale slider here. If I drag scale to the right, you can see that I've compressed the gradient. There are much fewer areas of white. So let's go back down to the left. Right about there looks pretty good. And you can see that I've expanded the highlights. Gives me a much more dramatic effect. And I'm going to hit OK. Let's move over here so we can take a look at our last headline type, Be Happier. I'm going to select that in the Layers panel. And here, when we work with white text, we're limited with the layer effects. Many of them require a color in order to show a visible change, but I'm going to show you a layer effect that will work on any color. This time, under Effects, I'm going to choose Stroke. Let's move things around a bit so we can see our text. There we go. What I'm going to do here is change the size of the stroke. That's a little bit heavy. I'm just going to come down 1 point to 2. So I'll type a 2 in there instead of a 3. That way we still have a little bit of air between the letters. For position, this stroke is on the outside of the typeface. I could set it inside. That would, in a sense, cut the typeface. I could set it to the center and split the difference. I'll leave this to outside. One last thing I'll do here is move down in the Fill Type box. I'll leave it set to color, but I want to change the color of that stroke, so I'm going to click in the color swatch box. I'll move this box down out of the way. Our screen is getting very crowded. Notice that as I move the mouse over the image area, I have again an eyedropper, so I'm going to click here in the upper right on this shirt, and now I have a blue stroke color. I'll hit OK to accept that color, and I'll hit OK to get out of the layer style dialog. And let's do a fit view to screen. That's Command 0 on the Mac, Control 0 on the PC. And let's take a look at how far we've come. I'll drag this over to the left, and let's go to our History panel. Here is the image that we started with, plain boring text, and here's where we ended up with layer effects plus a bit of color. We've only begun to scratch the surface of what's possible using layer effects, and now that this lesson is over, I'd like for you to keep this image on screen and experiment. Go through the layer effects options, try different settings, see what you can come up with all on your own.